Welcome everyone. My name is Stuart Croft. I'm the Vice Chancellor at the University. It's fantastic to see everyone here, and also welcome to those who are watching online as well. I've just checked with our speaker. She is ready, so we'll begin the proceedings. And I wanted to say, if I may, to start with, that Africans have been incredibly important to the history of this university. Some of the very first students in 1965 were from Africa. We've had, over a period of time since, so many distinguished African alumni across many different departments in our university. We have, at the moment, a series of extraordinary annual student-led Africa summits, which are incredible. We've had for 10 or 15 years now lots of collaboration through Warwick and Africa on education. And of course, we have so many research collaborations, again, across so many different departments within this university. And we decided a little over a year ago to create a Warwick hub in order to try to bring about a little more focus of all this activity with partners in Africa. And a year ago, we launched that hub, and we had our very first annual Distinguished Africa Lecture given by Ernest Ayeti, the current Secretary General of the African Research Universities Alliance. And in the period since then, it has been wonderful on the part of Warwick to be part of a process whereby the Guild of European Research Intensive Universities and the African equivalent that Ernest is Secretary General of have been collaborating so intensely to create some clusters of excellence. And I'll pick on Jan Palmoski here, who's the Secretary General of the Guild, who personally has done so much work with Ernest to create a position where we now have, I think the count is 20-ish clusters. There may be a moment of some merger and some other processes, but 20 or so clusters, not only of the universities in the two alliances, but many other partners outside as well. In this process of bringing together so much work across the university, I'd like just to thank a few people, if I may. Dan Branch, who's been fantastically important in bringing so much of this about. Sally Smith over there, who's been fantastically important also in bringing this about. Mike Shipman. Now, Mike, he's leaving us. It's outrageous, I know, but Mike is going to leave us. But Mike, thank you so much for the work that you've done here as well. But of course, also the inimitable Franklin Nisk. The inimitable Franklin, Uncle Franklin, as every single African student knows him, has done so much wonderful work. A round of applause, please, for Franklin and all that he has done. He will tell me off for that later, but it was worth it. It was worth it. I'm delighted to hear about the session that took place just before the break with apparently a lot of intense and excellent discussion. So we're looking forward, hopefully, to a lot of intense and excellent discussion following today's second annual Distinguished African Lecture. And my goodness me, we do have a distinguished speaker for us all today. I'd like to introduce, although she really needs very little introduction, Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela of Stellenbosch University. Stellenbosch and Warwick have just signed a new memorandum of understanding to create some more areas of bilateral collaboration. Winner of the Harry Oppenheimer Fellowship Award, Harvard Radical Fellowship, honorary doctorates from Frederick Schiller University and Rhodes University, books that have won prizes, major prizes in South Africa and in the United States. We have someone here who is genuinely a world expert, and I'm delighted to introduce, to speak to the topic from South Africa with love and forgiveness, probing the limits of remorse, Professor Gobodo-Madikizela. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Stuart Croft, for the invitation. and for the introduction, for the warm introduction. It's really such a joy for me to be here. It's the first time I have visited Warwick University, and for that, I have a few people to thank. First of all, I've thanked the Vice Chancellor already for the invitation, but over the internet and connection via online communication, there was a communication between our Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research with Professor Franklin Lisk, whom I've now heard he is Uncle Lisk. I hope people call me Auntie Gobodo-Madikizela back home. So you are very lucky to be recognized for your seniority as Uncle Lisk. So thank you very much. Our Deputy Vice Chancellor, I know Professor Sibumoyo has welcomed you when you visited our university, and we're so grateful for the opportunities, the possibilities for our own students to be on exchange with your university and our postdoctoral fellows as well. We spoke earlier on about that possibility. I would like to thank Dan Branch, who I was introduced to by my dear friend Azrini, who I am thanking last because we have formed such a special relationship with you, both personally and with our center back at Stellenbosch University, with our students and postdocs who grew to love you so specially. So Azrini, thank you very much for your own role in this collaboration. I really am very grateful. Corina and your colleagues who were operating behind the scenes with all the practical arrangements, and thank you very much. Really appreciate that. I've met a few people here this evening who come from South Africa, and one of whom actually is an alumni of our university, Stellenbosch University, and has joined your university in education department. My title tonight is From South Africa with Love and Forgiveness, Probing the Limits of Forgiveness. I thought about this title when I was listening earlier to the panel discussion on inequality, learning the hub on inequality in Africa. I wondered how to connect the themes of my talk to what was debated earlier, which mostly focused on the economics of things. And I think it doesn't require too much of a stretch to make the connection, because the issues that I discuss here are about the consequences of oppression, the legacies of violence, of dehumanization and the exclusion of Black people under apartheid South Africa. At least I use South Africa as a framework for this discussion on From South Africa with Love and Forgiveness, a very necessary topic. And I begin with these two concepts, love and forgiveness, the love of humanity and the capacity to forgive, because they so powerfully represent what's possible in the woundedness of our post-colonial, post-apartheid worlds. I draw from two different archives, actually not so different archives, different in the sense of the directions from which the two people come. And one is Hannah Arendt, and the other one is James Baldwin. In her book, The Human Condition, about the human condition and the challenge of living together in a pluralistic world, Hannah Arendt writes that the very need for forgiveness emerges from, quote, the irreversibility and unpredictability of the process that begins with acting. Human actions, Hannah Arendt observes, are irreversible and unpredictable. And we can never undo what we have done, and we often lack the capacity to fathom the full consequences of our actions. The consequence of actions cannot be erased, and the only hope to live in relationship despite the irreversibility of the deeds that rupture our relationships is forgiveness. And she says, quote, "The possible redemption from the predicament of irreversibility, of being unable to undo what one has done, is the faculty of forgiving. Forgiveness is the only way to break the cycle of resentment and revenge that follows from our actions, the only faculty capable of creating new possibilities for the future." Arendt adds to this faculty of forgiving the dimension of being able to make and keep a promise. And she adds, quote, "Without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would, as it were, be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover. We would remain the victims of its consequences forever." She's talking here about the capacity for transformation. Without being bound to the fulfillment of promises, we would never be able to keep our identities. We would be condemned to wander helplessly and without direction in the darkness of each man's lonely heart, caught in its contradictions and equivocalities. A darkness which only the light shed over the public realm through the presence of others who confirm the identity between the one who promises and the one who fulfills can dispel. In other words, we need others to reconfirm our sense of identity as moral human beings. Without the presence of others, without the voice of those others to acknowledge our readmission into the realm of human others, we are doomed, as she argues here, into this place, this dark place of lonely hearts. This is very important in this discussion this afternoon because I speak about a process that allows people to re-enter the realm of the moral humanity after these tragedies that have occurred in countries like South Africa, the violence and the murders. So, according to Arendt, both forgiveness and promise depend on the relationship with others, on the plurality, on the presence and action of others, unquote. The second theme in the title of my talk, love, is not a concept that we often see or read about in the scholarship on political life, although the concept has been debated by thought leaders across disciplines, across time. Hannah Arendt herself considers love to have no place in politics. And one of the most provocative and controversial exchanges on this issue occurred between her and James Baldwin in 1962, when Baldwin, in his Letter from a Region in My Mind, later published in his book, The Fire Next Time, made a call for love as the only way to interrupt the legacy of racism and oppression. The gospel of love that Baldwin preached, Arendt wrote to Baldwin, is a dangerous, quote, anti-political force, unquote, that belongs to the private realm, not the public one. And she continues, love, by reason of its passion, destroys the in-between which relates us to and separates us from others. Love, by its very nature, is unworldly, and it is for this reason, it is not only apolitical, but anti-political. A very strong statement from Arendt. And she goes on to say to emphasize the point, perhaps the most powerful of all anti-political forces, unquote. I do not resolve here the question of whose wisdom between Arendt and Baldwin should be embraced with greater receptivity than the other. I offer only insights from my own work, insights that point to the potentiality of both these forces. The art of possibility is a central object of concern that is vital to the project of social transformation in the aftermath of violent histories. These pasts and their continuing legacies, marked by the violence of dehumanization and depersonalization of public and social life, ask of us to gather our sense of moral imagination, to approach the larger issues of racism and social transformation with the courage of the new humanism that Frantz Fanon and Steve Biko spoke about as an alternative for the post-European, post-colonial, post-apartheid era. And I quote now from Frantz Fanon, to emphasize the importance of this point of engaging with the other from the perspective of this new humanism, this vision of new humanism he writes about towards the end of his book. Both the oppressed and the oppressor must turn their backs on the inhuman voices which are those of their respective ancestors in order that authentic communication be possible. Before it can adopt a positive voice, freedom requires an effort at disalienation. Those of you who've read Fanon will remember that he writes about the problem of alienation. And here he says, what is needed for freedom to adopt a positive voice is an effort at disalienation. The simple attempt to touch the other, to feel the other, to explain the other to myself. And this is the reason I am returning to these concepts of love and forgiveness for this important point. And I say this not uncritically because we also understand that we're talking here about interpersonal encounters in the aftermath of these violent tragedies. We're talking about encounters between people, individuals who have committed atrocities and the victims that they have wounded. We are not talking about the structural, the edifices of these systematic abuse, histories of systematic abuse. So I'm not uncritical, but I am arguing here that to focus only on redistribution of resources without a particular attention to these relational processes, it misses the point for us, because if we think about hatred, how hatred is born, how it's cultivated, how it expands from individuals into the society, we have to think about how to interrupt the cycle of hatred and resentment. And this is what I'm talking about here. And so in responding then to Professor Lisk's invitation to address you this afternoon, I draw from the tradition of storytelling to share with you unique historical moments that have been illuminating. These stories are less from the great philosophers and religious or political theorists than from ordinary people who themselves have suffered irreparably. I turn, therefore, to a site that has been an important site in my research, and this is the site of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its archive. That shining moment in our history whose enduring lessons about what is possible in the aftermath of so much tragedy still shine brightly in my memory, having served as the chair of the Truth Commission's Human Rights Violations Committee in the Western Cape region. The TRC was an effort to call to the minds of society, the call by people like Frantz Fanon, Steve Biko, Nelson Mandela, and others towards this sense of a new humanism, an alternative to this post-European colonial era. It was an effort to imbue the realm of law, justice, and politics with a relational cultural ethics of Ubuntu, which places emphasis on the value of a reparative process rather than one that may deepen divisions of the past and perpetuate the victimization that characterized South African society under apartheid rule. There is a tendency for international legal institutions among scholars of human rights to rely too narrowly on retribution as the only legitimate response to state-orchestrated violence to help countries transition from democratic rule to democratic rule. This approach has been inherited from the German Nuremberg trials model. One of the problems with trying individuals who have committed crimes under the explicit or implicit orders of their governments is that the law focuses too strictly on the question of individual responsibility. All law does and must focus on individual responsibility because it is not possible to hold anything else responsible. Individuals must take the stand and be accused, but where the law in trying human rights violations that it pays little or no attention to the question of structural and systemic crimes, the surrounding ideology, the political philosophy, the setting up of enabling structures for perpetrators, and an administrative executive system that protects their murderous operations. In other words, the law has its own way of approaching crimes, but doesn't really address these crimes that are of a systemic nature in the way, especially when the vision is to build a sense of connection with people who in the past were under the orders of a warped system of violence. In this paper, I explore the dynamics of remorse and reflect on the broader ramifications of significant and notable expressions of remorse by perpetrators who appeared before the TRC Commission, by basing my discussion around an encounter with one perpetrator who was known as the chief assassin of apartheid. Eugene de Kock, the former commander of covert and death squad operations of the apartheid security police, will be a central figure in this discussion. But I will draw also from stories of some of his victims as well to elucidate some of the points that I want to make. The perspective I take here on remorse is based on understanding remorse as a relational intersubjective phenomenon that opens up the possibility of transformative moments and a space for the production of ethical subjects in societies emerging from mass trauma and violence. Looking at remorse in the context of punishment and sentencing processes where the question of the avoidance of the remedies of the law may be relevant takes it out of the relational context and confines the debate to the role it serves for individual perpetrators. This often leads to a search for evidence of remorseful feeling by shining the spotlight too narrowly on physical manifestations of perpetrators' distress. I give you a striking example of this moment when a perpetrator demonstrates physical distress, and many people believe that this is a sign of genuine response of remorse. Some of you may have seen the film by Joshua Oppenheimer, The Act of Killing, in which a group of elderly men who, in their younger days, operated a death squad during the Indonesian communist purge. These men in the film reenact murders that they committed with exceptional brutality. In a scene that has been interpreted as a show of remorse, in some scholarly analysis of the film, one of the perpetrators, the self-confessed executioner, Anwar Congo, is filmed on a rooftop at the site where he killed many of his victims by choking them with wire nooses. In the film, his body suddenly breaks into spasms. He is seen in the film bending over a trough, dry heaving and making seemingly uncontrollable retching sounds. Although questions have been raised about the authenticity of the scene, with some authors suggesting that Remorse might be scripted or seemed staged, others have interpreted this performative act of revulsion as a sign of death squad leaders' remorse. In the words of Janet Walker, who comments on this film and analyzes this film, she says, quote, "If we are not satisfied with Anwar's verbal expression of remorse, here is the somatic response," unquote. My own view on this is that it will be misleading to think that bodily reactions alone are a sign of remorse. It may well be that a perpetrator's remorse is made visible through embodied wrenching pain. But I wonder, is the experience depicted in Oppenheimer's film the perpetrator's remorseful confrontation with guilt for the murderous callousness of the crimes he committed? Or is it a case of the explosive eruption of shame in memory? The return of the perpetrator's voice of conscience, previously silenced, exploding into a feeling of self-disgust and self-convulsed repulsion. In other words, rather than empathic resonance evoked in the perpetrator by the recognition of human suffering caused by his murderous legacy, could this be a self-focused reaction that reflects a feeling of disgrace and a diminished sense of worth as a human being, rather than concern for the suffering of his victims? In my view, remorse emerges from a deep sense of guilt, recognition and acknowledgement that the perpetrator's actions led to the harm and suffering of victims. In order to be meaningful, remorse should evoke feelings of concern for the victim, enough to wish to make amends for the suffering that the perpetrator's actions have caused. I call this true remorse, although there are different levels of trueness in expression of this kind of remorse, which I will not go into now. Remorse occurs, in other words, at an internal, intrapsychic, and cognitive level, and it requires the following three characteristics. First, recognition of the pain of the suffering other, and that the perpetrator is the cause of the pain. Second, an admission of wrongdoing without any excuse of justification, and acknowledge guilt for the crime and take full responsibility for it. The perpetrator should not only face their guilt, but they should also feel the guilt. This is an important distinction because a perpetrator can simply face up to what they have done, but deny personal responsibility by rationalizing their actions with justifications such as, it was a war, I was obeying orders. It is as if the person was saying, I give you what you want. Full disclosure, here is the list of the evil deeds that I perpetrated without actually reflecting in any responsible, fundamental way. I therefore consider acknowledgement the knowledge that answers the question, what happened? Who is responsible? In a way that goes beyond simply dishing out facts, the most critical aspect of remorse. Albie Sachs, a retired justice of the Constitutional Court in South Africa, has emphasized this point. Himself a victim who was left, they tried to kill him, he was left without an arm and blindness in one of his eyes. He says that it's very important that acknowledgement presupposes a sense of responsibility for the occurrence and understanding of the meaning that it has for the persons involved and for society as a whole. An acknowledgement of wrongdoing conveys a preparedness to take responsibility, to respond in a manner that conveys a care for one's victims. The meaning of responsibility is conveyed in my language in a very dramatic word that is in my language. It's ukuthwala uxanduva. Now that word is both in its onomatopoetic sound and it's in its gravity depicts the idea of someone carrying the load and carrying the responsibility for the acts that have been committed. And I like that word because it conveys so powerfully what is required in an act of responsibility. Now, perpetrators, by virtue of having faced their crimes head on, those who are remorseful, having faced their crimes head on, face a danger of not only being confronted with the shame of what they've done, but also facing daily the images and the crowd of their crimes, the dead bodies in their memories, the people that they've murdered in their memories, those who have a conscience, at least they face this daily. And this is the tragedy. But it's important to underscore that for as long as perpetrators can explain in the sense of giving their actions meaning, in other words, not to deny, but rather to explain it as something that they were doing for the benefit of the larger society. It's a holding, it provides them with a sense of holding. But when this is absent, when the acknowledgement by the society for whom they were committing their crimes is absent, if the white society in South Africa are in constant denial, and this is a problem that we understand with all these crimes, denial is a big problem when people are faced with having to face the fact that they were beneficiaries of oppressive systems. But the tragedy for perpetrators is then that they are left to face the shame alone. The problem with perpetrators such as Eugene de Kock is that they have gone too far. Eugene de Kock, in my interviews with him, told me that he's killed so many people, he doesn't remember how many people he has killed. And so for perpetrators like him, who have effaced the victims completely, they are facing their own crimes of dehumanizing the self, because before they perpetrate crimes, they have to dehumanize the self. Now, if the dehumanization of the self and the murderous deeds begin with such a perversion of morality that the perpetrator loses all barriers that serve to shield human beings from the shame of descending into this darkness of depravity, they may have reached a point of no return when they have no structures to support them, to give their murderous deeds a sense of meaning because of the denial of the rest of the society. They've plunged, therefore, into these depths of depravity alone, and they've reached this point of no return, a deeply fundamental limit on the capacity of the self to fully be restored as the perpetrator tries to come out of the doldrums of this depravity is non-existent. He is left alone. And this is the crisis of remorse. And this is why I speak here about the limits of remorse. The limits because those for whom he committed the crimes are no longer present to give his actions meaning. And what is the hope then of reintroducing these people like him, like de Kock and others, into the realm of moral humanity, and for us to think even about a community of human beings that are now on the journey together towards reconstructing the social order. This is a problem. The circle of accountability for human rights crimes extends to include this wider society that is now in denial. The repeated calls of acknowledgement by different groups of indigenous people and descendants of enslaved and oppressed people are a crying out for those implicated in violent histories to carry this burden of transgenerational pain and hurt inherited by the victims of crimes, of these crimes. The complicity, if the complicity by these others continues to be denied, it leaves our societies in a quandary. South Africa today faces questions about the very meaning of the reconciliation agenda, which 30 years after the introduction of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the journey towards freedom, we still have to witness what it means to be free for many people in South Africa. The notion of responsibility is so critical here, again, referring to James Baldwin and his conversation with Margaret Mead on the importance of responsibility. We are reminded by that conversation that happened in the early 1970s. The relevance of that conversation continues to be of high importance today because of the nature of our societies, of oppressed communities that are descendants of victims who were oppressed over several generations, and this continues today. So this is very important then that perpetrators do show the remorse in order to remind the rest of the society for whom they were committed their acts that they too ought to confess. Ultimately, what makes remorse possible is the perpetrator's subject position of facing their guilt, and this compared to the failure of the society on whose behalf they're committing the acts, not to acknowledge the crimes and instead to deny vehemently their role in the crimes. The TRC's invitational stance and the promise of amnesty without the threat of punishment may open the door for this to be possible. What do we need to do for the rest of society that benefited from oppression to open the door for them too to admit wrongdoing in order to stand in solidarity with people who have suffered in the past? There is always a question, of course, and I've been asked this question, how do you know that remorse is genuine? How can one tell when remorse is not witness stand remorse? When desperate for moral leniency and with no way out, the perpetrator acts remorseful. One set of questions, the how can we know question, has to do with verifiability. A second set has to do with the moral possibility itself, the psychological and epistemological possibility of achieving authentic remorse in the wake of having performed the most indescribable acts. Both sets of questions are real and both are legitimate. Yet it remains equally legitimate that when perpetrators do in fact express remorse or regret or contrition, however it may be ascertained, what seems to lie, as Nicholas Tavuch has said, beyond the purview of apology can in fact be transformed from an unforgivable deed into a forgivable one. In this sense, then, remorse transforms the perpetrator into a moral agent because, in the first place, it lays bare the fact that the perpetrator transgressed accepted moral codes. In the second place, an expression of remorse demonstrates that the perpetrator is ready to embrace values shared by the wider community that denounces the human rights violations in which the perpetrator participated, and that the perpetrator is now willing to rejoin the realm of moral humanity and to build a moral community. They were the perpetrators facing their crimes with a reduced sense of moral and ethical obligation towards their victim. And people like de Kock expressed this in very poignant terms to say that we had to close our eyes to the possibility that I'm engaging with a human other. He says in one instance that in that second or two when he's about to commit the act, you sometimes see the other person's face. I can see some of the faces today still, the shock, the fear, the desperation, the look of this is it. No, you see the people, it's real. I mean, this person is alive. You can see the fear, you can smell it, but you are on automatic because your training takes over. You don't allow yourself to think of the faces you see, unquote. A young woman whose mother was killed in this very ethos of understanding the relationship with Black people who are opposed to apartheid, Marcia Khoza decides to go and visit Eugene de Kock in prison. She was 4 years old when her mother was killed. She's now in her late 30s, in her late 20s. She meets Eugene de Kock in prison, and I ask her what was most memorable about the moment of the encounter with Eugene de Kock. She says, I only had 1 hour to talk to him, to find out as much as possible about what my mother was wearing, what she said, what she looked like. I had 1 hour for the prison visitation hours. And the more I was watching the clock ticking by, the closer and closer I was coming to him because we sat in opposite a narrow table. And at some point, she says, our knees were touching and I could feel my nose was very close to his and we were breathing the same air. I thought to myself at the time, the notion of breathing the same air is such a powerful metaphor for what is possible in these kinds of encounters with people who have hurt you or people who have taken something from you and have left you empty and naked without any resources to look forward to a future life. And so for de Kock and people like him who efface the humanity of the other, there comes this kind of moment when they are now encountering the face of the other in person. As Marcia Khoza waits for de Kock to come into the visiting space, he walks through the door, and Marcia describes the moment when de Kock, as their eyes meet, she says he begins to trip as he goes towards her. He trips. And the first thing he says to her is, you look so much like your mother. He could see some of the faces of the victims of his murderous operations, and the faces that he sees, he said to me, they are like a calling card. And here was a calling card now in front of him. Marcia Khoza's face reminding him of the face of his mother, of her mother. But the limits of forgiveness, Marcia Khoza, by the way, she comes to prison already with a sense of, I want to forgive him, but I want him to give me reasons to forgive him. The language of forgiveness is limited. The language of reconciliation is limited because here we're talking about two people, but this is one person who represents so much more in the history of the violation of apartheid. So engaging in this dialogue with him with them across time and in the same space or across space is necessary for shifting the lenses from a politics of a return of violence with violence to a politics of engagement at a different level. And I say this because forgiveness and reconciliation are, I say the idea of forgiveness and reconciliation being limited is that they are terminal, they suggest something terminal, like something that can be finished, can be concluded. And yet, when we think about these encounters with Marcia Koza encountering Eugene de Kock and several other persons of victims' families encountering perpetrators, we witness how much complicated these encounters are. They are not encounters that are aimed towards a goal, to reach a goal of reconciliation, a goal of forgiveness as such. Forgiveness emerges as the emergent response in an unexpected encounter. Much of what happens in these experiences is complicated, enigmatic, muddy, elusive, and unpredictable. And these responses, in many cases, are unexpected. The story of South Africa, therefore, is a story that requires us to return to these encounters, not in a way to define the outcome of the goals of these encounters. In our quest for transformation, for social transformation, it's important to begin with these possibilities that there might be a solidarity, a sense of solidarity established between people coming from different sides of history, and the possibility that they might act towards social justice. The dreams in South Africa that were deferred, the dreams that were shattered because of opportunities lost under a system of discriminatory laws, meant that to exclude and degrade individuals, communities declared inferior by apartheid continues to live on in the generations through this transgenerational transmission of poverty. The generations of people who are inheriting the poverty from parents who were excluded under apartheid is a generation that now encounters a generation of white South Africans who inherited wealth under the apartheid system. And being in institutions such as ours, Stellenbosch University, which is a white institution, requires this kind of new humanism, this new way of engaging with the past, not in a way that excludes and dehumanizes another and repeats the violence, but in a way that is much more invitational, precisely because we have to live with one another. At Stellenbosch University, one of the observations that I've made is the problem, is what I call the problem of proximity. The problem of proximity being the fact that students of color who come to the university are excited to come to Stellenbosch University. It's an opportunity of a lifetime. They have grants that are supporting them in ways that are possible, and sometimes they struggle even with that support because of corruption in our country. But once they are in proximity with white kids, they realize just how poor they are, how poor their circumstances are. And this inspires a sense of anger, a sense of hate for the circumstances that the history has put them in. And how do we respond to this? How do we hold these spaces so that in these conversations, we do not lose sight of the fact that in the final analysis, we have to live with one another. There is, of course, the importance of the fact that the structure, the edifices, the structural edifices of apartheid and oppression still remain. And that needs to be addressed. But in a society that is so filled with denial, what is our hope for inviting the society to confront their benefits under the system of oppression of apartheid in order to stand on the side of victims who have inherited the poverty and inherited the oppression. What do we need to do? And I am arguing in this work that these potentialities of love, of forgiveness, limited as they are, that to open the space to create the possibility of building these zones of solidarity remains important for us. Now, it's very important for us, and this is the last point that I want to discuss this evening. It's very important for us to understand that on both sides, there is something that is passed on transgenerationally on both sides. From the side of students of color or the younger generation that has inherited these histories, they are inheriting a history, but they're also inheriting all the unfinished business about this past. White students on the other side are also inheriting a certain ethos of understanding what Black-white relationships are about. And from that perspective that is inherited, it's the perspective of superiority, that the identity of whiteness is from a place of understanding their position as that of superiority. To disrupt that, we need these processes of encounter that open the space for this kind of engagement. And to conclude, as an example of some of what we did at the Truth Commission, keeping in mind the importance of these encounters and how we are driving these encounters in order to create the spaces of solidarity. Here is a moment that I was involved in organizing at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of an encounter between a white woman whose son died in the apartheid army in Namibia from a mortar bomb that was thrown by the SWAPO during South Africa's invasion of these countries, neighboring countries, and an encounter between this woman and a woman whose son was murdered by the apartheid security police. They both wanted to be in conversation with one another. And what we witnessed in that encounter is how the stories that were unfolding were stories about what happened to them and their children, sharing these stories, connecting with one another, and embracing their stories of suffering. And it seemed to me that while this is not a perfect example of what's possible, that this idea that the space can be created for people coming from different sides of history to connect becomes a very powerful example to think about how we might do that in other contexts. This woman, for example, talks about my son who was 18 years old when he was conscripted into South Africa's Defence Force during apartheid. He was brought back in a body bag and I was not allowed to see him. And the Black woman talks about how the soldiers of apartheid came to the townships and murdered her son, and she describes how her son looked in that moment. I don't want to romanticize these kinds of stories, but they are stories about what's possible in these encounters. This is really what I would like you to take away from this, the potentiality for these kinds of encounters to happen. It is ironic that the same factors that can ignite and perpetuate animosity, fear and hatred, the love for those killed or maimed by the other, might also be suspended. And the person might also suspend those negative sentiments by providing a way into the experience of the enemy. Love and loss may provide a way out of violence. Ultimately, love and loss are what is common, and thus, in a sense, are what is shared. it seems clear that once people, even those who are adversaries, are faced with each other, innumerable possibilities, both destructive and restorative, and all that cannot be reduced to these oversimplified categories, arise both within and between bodies. I think one can accept that those encountering each other will be affected, whether they will necessarily be affected in a way that will move them to not only a new relationship, but one of solidarity with the suffering other, a shared vision of what the future should be. The potential for the unexpected, unforeseen, and thoroughly creative, endemic to the human condition, is always present. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Utterly brilliant. I think you could hear a pin drop through that lecture as we were all engrossed in all that you were saying. It was absolutely brilliant and wonderful, and if I may say, also quite harrowing to listen to some of those stories. I'm left with a positive feeling, though, because as you described the potentiality of those zones of solidarity, that's a thing I think for us to focus on. Now, please, we have a little time. I hope we're going to have a few questions also online, but may I throw open for any comments or questions or points that anybody would like to make in response to that extraordinary lecture, please. Gentleman there, please. We're going to bring a microphone to you, if that's okay. Just to be absolutely clear that we can hear you. Just coming across just behind you, if that's okay. Yes, if we have on one side, on the other side. Just behind you coming, sorry for this. Please just introduce yourself as well, if you would.
Hi, my name's Samson. I am an alumni. I studied medical biotechnology and business management, a master's, and I now work in tech in London. My question is because you spoke about remorse. It emerges from a deep sense of guilt, and then you coined the term true remorse, which true remorse plus action. Really and truly, it sounds like repentance, you know, actually making atonement and doing something. So how do you help in terms of what is an action plan that you put in place for people to get the rubber to meet the road and make action, take action?
Thank you very much for that question. One of the points that I sort of, put in the background of my presentation was the need for real structural transformation. But I want to argue in this work, or I try to argue in this work, that that's not enough. In order for us to get support for these kinds of causes that about changing institutional cultures, changing the structures of oppression that are so enduring, we require a community of others to act in solidarity. And so what I mean here is that you are cultivating really the possibility that people will connect in solidarity. And so it is in the act of solidarity, or in this union of solidarity, that it becomes possible to fight for social justice in order for change to take place. There's a beautiful example in our institution just recently, last week actually, or 2 weeks ago, where a group of Afrikaners are fighting the changes that are happening at our university. They were members of the leaders in the convocation, the university convocation, and so with a lot of power and with representation also in council. For several weeks, they were bombarding the university. The story is complicated, but the underlying issue is that they were bombarding the university with calls for the vice chancellor to step down because he is associated with changing several changes, including making English the main language of instruction at the university, and other changes that have taken place, visible changes that have taken place at the university. A group of people started by a white woman who worked with several people. I mention white woman deliberately because this is very critical. These kinds of causes require those who were associated with the side of the oppression of others. And so the movement that started, it started in a very small way. She really said, not in my name. And that was her mantra, not in my name. And several Black alumni also said, not in the name of the future of our children. It grew in such a massive way that it brought tears to so many of us how it grew. And these people are now, as we speak, voted out. That is the kind of action that I mean, the sense of solidarity that you need one person to start, and then the sense of solidarity is strengthened, and then the fight for change then combines. It's not just a fight by Black people, it's a fight by all people. And in these cases, white people are needed more than anything else. Because they are usually the ones who can draw other white people into the fold of solidarity. So that is an example that I think is a very useful way of thinking about how we move from solidarity to action.
Thank you. Jan here, I think had his hand up. Please catch my eye if there's others who would like to say something.
Thank you very much. As a German historian, or at least that's the context of my question, I'm really struck by the differentiation or the sort of differentness between the individual acts of forgiveness that you really describe and the sort of collective denial, which of course in the case of German history post-45 has really taken 3 generations. It's only then that's been possible to really confront this collective guilt, really. And I wonder, what is it that we're missing also from your work? So is this about performative acts or rituals or whatever that to enable society to really take a wider sense of that responsibility and overcome that disconnect between the individual particular coming to terms and this wider piece?
The Truth and Reconciliation was in a way a response to that. It was intended to build that sense of collective response to what happened in the past and an invitation to that. And for a moment, it worked. Although there was some opposition to the process of the TRC, but there was in general a shared sense of we are writing a new future, all of us. And that context of the ritual of the Truth Commission, because it was a kind of a ritual. It was also a kind of a story of a return to a kind of cultural language, if you may, because at the Truth Commission, there was music, there was, people were singing together, there was the testimonies that were given in public and shared publicly, so that even the person who was not in the room in terms of real time and in the same place, in terms of real time, they were experiencing it via the radio. They may have been disconnected from place, but in terms of time, they were witnessing it in real time. The problem is that at the end of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that process ended. And when it ended, it was as if we've done it all. And there was no continuity. And I think that is what was missing with the TRC, that these processes are so fixed with time. They've got a mandate period, that there is no structure in terms of how do we continue this kind of conversation so that it continues to impart these important messages transgenerationally. And this is to say the same thing about when change happens, even institutionally, you make goals, you achieve some goals within institutions. The dorms become more mixed, the classes become more mixed. After 3 years, another group of students come and they come with another group of students comes, and the group has got different, they come from different environments. And so it unsettles whatever achievement was made. And so this is what happened in our country as well. And then, of course, the importance of leadership, because leaders of apartheid refused to actually give an unequivocal apology. They were very much couched, the apologies that were given by people like de Klerk. In fact, de Klerk at some point said, young people have got nothing to feel guilty about. And so there is this sense of denial that happens in Germany. It happened too, and still continues in some circles. But in Germany, there are rules that make it difficult for people to deny. Even in South Africa, there shouldn't be denial, but in terms of the collective, there is a narrative now among the majority of white people, certainly not all, but the majority of white people, that we worked hard for what we got. A black government is now in power, and besides, it is corrupt. So, what are we supposed to feel guilty about? And so those are some of the dangers of these processes. So one is a multifaceted way of approaching these problems. The problem of denial itself is culturally, it's across cultures. When there are crimes, Hannah Arendt, there are scholars who have written about this. Stanley Cohen writes about the state of denial. Marita Sturken, in her book Entangled Memories, they write this is a problem. Denial is a problem in all these countries that have a history of violation. And so the challenge is, how do you replicate these processes that are much more complex, that are much more collective? How do you replicate it? And it remains a problem. So you find that we can, we act within these institutions like the universities, the churches, the small NGO communities. It becomes incredibly difficult when people in positions of power are not themselves setting the tone to say, look, this is who we are. This is who we were in the past. Let us acknowledge and, and help to uplift the rest of our society. The majority of white South Africans refuse to pay the reconciliation tax. They refuse, completely. It was proposed, but there was no sense of continuity of that discussion. They just did not want to give anything in terms of what they benefited. So it remains a problem, but precisely because it is a problem, it means that the efforts have to be doubled. The efforts to combat the problem have to be doubled. There lies it's the same as racism, that precisely to say that we cannot eradicate racism doesn't mean that, well, it's a lost cause. It means precisely because, it is difficult to eradicate, we must double our efforts, and there's the reason that critical race theory was created was a response to the impossibility of eradicating racism. So we faced these challenges. We are faced with these challenges in our worlds.
Thanks. Gabrielle Lynch, I work in the politics department. I mean, first of all, just thank you for a really excellent talk. Moving, but also quite inspiring. My questions come from having worked on the Kenyan Truth Commission. So one thing that strikes me as a difference, in your talk, you were speaking at length about the importance of acknowledgement and then remorse. And one thing that really struck me from the Kenyan Truth Commission is, despite years of public hearings, 40,000 plus statements, there's only one incident of somebody admitting wrongdoing, and that was in an in-camera hearing. So everybody else who was, said to have done something, who was brought before the commission, denied wrongdoing. And I'm just wondering, why do you think South Africa and the TRC in South Africa did manage to encourage or facilitate so many people to acknowledge the wrongdoing? Was it just the amnesty that was provided, in which case maybe acknowledgement, but not really remorse because it was instrumental to acknowledge wrongdoing? Or was there something else about that moment in South African history with the sense of a real transition to a very different type of government, idea of the Rainbow Nation? I mean, was there something kind of in the air that made people feel hopeful and inspired about a different kind of future, that made people feel that they wanted to acknowledge what they'd done and seek forgiveness for it? And then just one other question, and another, I suppose, key difference with the Kenyan Truth Commission is it's the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, and building on the South African TRC, Kenyans felt it was very important to place justice at the centre, and different types of justice, kind of retributive justice through ensuring accountability, also reparative justice, also restorative justice. And I heard you mention kind of restorative in passing, but there wasn't such an emphasis on justice in your talk. And I'm just wondering whether you think, the South African TRC should have placed more emphasis on justice, or whether justice was something that should have happened afterwards. As you said, it's a short time-bound process that can't be expected to do everything. So yeah, I'm just wondering how justice would fit in. Thank you.
I have some very, what shall I call it, devious views on justice, which, I mean, they're not really devious, they're kind of other, they are alternative views on the notion of justice, because having witnessed so many people coming to the TRC, first of all, to say that, yes, of course, there are people who wanted justice in the criminal sense, prosecutorial sense of justice. They wanted the justice. They were, in fact, when the Truth Commission started, there was a legal opposition to the hearings of the TRC, to the extent that the first hearings were stalled for several, maybe 2 or 3 sessions. We had to stall the commission because the commission was challenged by some families to say they wanted justice, the prosecutorial kind of justice. And having had these hearings of the Truth Commission, I hesitate to say this, but I really witnessed a different kind of justice, which was a much more emotional kind of justice, where people, it doesn't mean that people didn't want perpetrators to pay, quote unquote, for their crimes. But there was a sense in which when people stood there and testified about what happened to them in front of packed audiences, there was something that, to me, this kind of devious understanding of justice, it seems to me, was a kind of a sense of justice. It was an emotional kind of justice. I give you one quick example. I know we're running out of time. The reason I started interviewing Eugene de Kock, I was driving and I was listening to a public hearing. He was speaking at a hearing in Port Elizabeth, and he was rolling out confessions and talking about who did what, and kind of, spilling out, names of people and things that people, to some extent, but he was just giving names. In other words, he was, in the eyes of the audience, he was bringing it on. And there was an applause, there was an applause. I parked my car on the side of the road. I couldn't believe it, that people were responding in this way to this terrible man who was called prime evil in South Africa. And so that is what inspired me to understand who is he, what is the relationship with some of the family members. And so I found that is that part of the justice. Now, the other question, your other question of should there have been justice? The commission had there was amnesty granted to people who gave full disclosure. I mean, flawed as that process was, there were several conditions. It was a conditional amnesty. Full disclosure was one of them. In public, speaking publicly about their crime, and the extent of whether they were doing this as part of their political motive or not. I mean, some of these reasons were muddy and fuzzy. Nonetheless, there were conditions. Now, the goal was that for all perpetrators who were not granted amnesty, they had to face prosecutions. But that did not happen in South Africa. The government sort of glossed over that recommendation and did nothing about it. As a result, it left huge sense of being unfinished for many victims. Some people would argue that this is the reason why there is so much violence in South Africa. They say because of amnesty and because these people are not tried, we are experiencing scenes of violence in South Africa. I've got a different view to that, but there have been studies that show that there is no relationship between the crime and the amnesty provision. But that remains a problem, that these people who were supposed to be tried, there are victims' families today who still want those trials to take place. They still have not taken place. So it was it was not so much like the Sierra Leonean dual, truth commission and justice process. There was a clear cut. There was a line between the Truth and Reconciliation Commission decisions and then a new beginning for those perpetrators who were not granted amnesty. But in the end, that was not effective at all.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid that does take us to the end of the formal part of our process. So I'd like to invite you all for a reception outside, if I may. But before we go, dear Pumla, thank you so much for this exceptional experience this afternoon. Please, a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.